Good evening, and welcome to the 66th Think Tank, where we talk about ideas for RPG games, settings, monsters, characters, and all that sort of thing. Generally brainstorming and mashing around ideas until we come up with something interesting. We're a little bit short as it's the summer and they're off doing things. So we've got Pat and Emily off camera, Jay and Mark. And tonight we're going to be mostly talking about a 90s, 40s necromancy setting, which we sort of came up with last week when we were talking about types of magic and things like that. And we've all loved this setting, so we've decided to dedicate this week to fleshing that one out a bit more. But we'll come to that in a moment. First of all, we'll do some check-ins. Mark, would you like to take us through some check-ins?
Yeah, sure. So we'll go through how everyone's week's been and how everybody feels. We'll start with James, actually, or Jay, as he first been known. So get us going.
Slow week. Slow week. Yes, it was a slow week, but today was better because I actually got some work done, and that's about it, really. Just slow and tiring and slow.
Okay, so that's James. Pat, how are you? Are you tired and slow from work, or has it been more energetic for you?
I'm certainly tired, but I've had quite a productive week actually. For the time that I've actually had free, I mean I've been in work most days, but I got a lot more 66 done than I usually do. Well, not than I usually do, than I have in recent weeks. And I even wrote some kind of other stuff for other projects as well, which I got done and finished and stuff, which is good.
Okay, cool. Emily, how are you doing?
My week's been very, very long. I was quite unwell halfway through this week. Just kind of recovering now, and yeah, lots of 8-hour shifts, so nice and awake.
Okay, so no good. Glad to hear you're better. Chris, how's your week been?
Yeah, nothing hugely exciting happening this week. Just lots of behind-the-scenes stuff, mostly working on the website, getting that updated so that we can go live and start selling the books very soon. That's all looking really nice. I'll probably start sharing out links tomorrow or the next day. So that's really good. And we also sent out the notification on the upgrades. People who backed us at one reward level, say just the PDFs or just the core books, giving them a chance to upgrade to the final books. And yeah, we've had several people take us up on that. So yeah, that's really good. So yeah, a positive, productive week, but not exciting.
Okay, that sounds great actually. We're really looking forward to seeing the sites. So I'll finish. I had 2 days at work today, and then I spent the rest of the week off. So I've come down back to Devon, which is where I currently am, and helping my parents redecorate their new house. So I've learned a lot about floorboards and wallpaper and things like that, which I didn't know before. So yeah, overall pretty good, and I can smell sausage and mash cooking as well. So yeah, quite good and happy. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Chris for the main meat of what we're discussing today.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, so 1940s necromancy. This comes out of the ideas we were talking about last week about different types of magic and how societies would evolve. And Mark came up with this idea of 1940 setting, but rather than the sort of like emerging electronics technology they had in our world, there's a magical technology which relies on calling in spirits or souls to power and drive devices. But that twisted, as we talked about it, to actually these spirits and souls were the spirits of dead people, and what are the consequences of World War I and all that glut of souls, and also what happens to those spirits when the machines break, and possibly about babies being born without spirits because all of the spirits are being used and put into these devices. So it turned into quite a dark and interesting setting, and we wanted to look at this more. So where we're going to start this week is we're going to try and flesh out the timeline of this world. And the starting point we're going to take is really the first discovery and or proof that this necromancy is real, that it exists, and it's not just some hocus pocus. And I'm thinking about those classic scientific experiments by people like Davy and Boyle, who demonstrated some fundamental scientific principle in some really easy and conclusive way. So at some point, if we have this necromantic technology, somebody must have done this. Someone must have put together an experiment and shown it and be able to reproduce it time and time again, and other people must have been able to go away and do it in exactly the same way. And so the question is, what is that experiment? You know, and I think why we want to talk about this is because it's going to lead us, what decision we make about this experiment will tell us about the technology, and then that will tell us how the society progresses after that. So, first of all, really, what is that experiment? Has anyone got anything they'd like to kick in? I think Jay.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know when, but one of the major things about what you picked up on, Chris, is that of the happy accident. Now, there were a fair few famous scientists out there who really got stuck in and spent a fair bit of time just repeatedly going over the same thing again and again and again and again. I'm thinking of the early chemists in the turn of the 18th century kind of stuff, the guys who discovered oxygen. They worked really quite hard on it. I quite like the idea of it being more on the lines of semi-accidental. So the story I have immediately in my head is that a famous scientist of the day goes along to a seance. Now, in our modern era, that's ridiculous because there's the disassociation between that kind of hocus pocus and more modern science. But you can imagine in the early 1800s, that separation simply didn't exist. They all didn't know that it wasn't science, so they didn't know it was trickery. So the immediate thought I had was that someone brings along some kinds of really prototype clockwork device to a seance. And at the end of the seance, it doesn't need winding.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting starting point because it gives you that very definite physical device and that first hint that you could do something useful with it. I mean, yeah, I mean, I wondered about also metronome. It's a very simple mechanical device, whether you could get it to stop or start with the sort of magical energy might also be another way rather than clockwork technology. From what you were saying, seances were big, and particularly about Victorian era, mid to late Victorian era, so that sort of puts us as a starting point around 1860. Perhaps.
I was just going to say, I like that idea, but it's still a happenstance. It's not a demonstrable repetition under science. So, I mean, I like the idea that somebody was able to use a pre-existing technique to like power some kind of device in a scientific expert or something like that. Like they had something theoretical, some kind of theoretical technology, like I don't know, a clock or something like that. So they go, well, I'm demonstrating that I can power this using pre-Christian rituals or something like that. There is one thing I did want to check very quickly, and I think it's a very important thing to determine right at the start. Do the people in this world realise where the power's coming from?
I think no. I think because part of the original idea was they thought they were binding some kind of outsider spirits or demons to do the work, and only later emerges that it's actually people's souls.
It's always a bit more fun when people are...
Yeah, I think the analogy I'm thinking of is like radiation, radium. When that was discovered, no one understood the health risks, and they all thought it was a wonder thing. So I think that's quite a good parallel we can draw on. But I think, Pat, going back to your original point, I think you're absolutely right. What Jay described is almost the preview to that scientific experiment. It's
Yeah.
what gets the scientist interested, and then he then goes away and works on it for some years and develops something more concrete and demonstrable. So yeah, I think there's a sort of like always preview to where we are. That's it. Jay works very well. Mark,
Well,
you've got some thoughts on the cloud chamber?
Yeah, I was thinking, can I follow on from James's seance idea? Say someone tries this in the 1860s, and then he's got this watch which never needs winding. He tries it a few more times, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. And then I can't imagine the trail going cold at that point, so it gets left for a long time until someone else then reads about his notes and picks it up later on with some other instrument to try to detect what's going on. And they set up all kinds of things in the in the room whilst they do the seance, and they find in a cloud chamber. I'll make sure you're familiar with it, but it's a very early radiation detection device. Essentially, you create this very, very precise cloud within a box. As radiation passes through it, it leaves these tracks of bubbles that you can see in the cloud. So imagine there's one of the like the early radiation measuring devices, and they have some of these things about space when they do this ritual, and they can actually see things in the cloud chamber as they do it. So they see something appear to come from outside of the room, flow inwards towards the device that they're doing the ritual around, and then the device then works differently. So this is kind of that's one of those earlier scientific proofs that there is something which comes from outside to inside, which then does something.
I think
It is a process, and then from that they can then start developing like a theoretical basis of how it works.
Yeah, it gives you that. The cloud shaper gives you that visualization, and measurement. That's the key thing. All science depends on measuring. If you can't measure it, it's not real. It's pretty much what it comes down to. So yeah, that's sort of cloud shaper. It'd be interesting to look at sort of when these things sort of came about, and but first of all, I mean, we've seen 1870s, 1880s was the development of the telegraph, and then radio waves were being discovered sometime around then, weren't they?
Yeah.
So, and they were also sort of like your first electronic devices, you know, the telegraph and the telephone, or the radio. So maybe there's an angle there. Maybe you can get them radio signals, and that's sort of like the key starting point to the technology. But still, the question is, we don't actually know what it is. You know, what happens in the seance or in this experiment to cause those things to appear in the cloud chamber? Do you chant? Do you sacrifice a goat? Do you think bad thoughts? So, Pat, what were you thinking about the seance?
Well, I do think, if you're looking at it from a scientific perspective, Mark, can you just mute your microphone? I can hear you.
Okay, sorry, I was going to...
I don't know if you're playing the drums. Sorry, what was the saying? Oh, that was right, yes. You have a, like, it's like medicine, in that it's like alternative medicine becoming medicine, in that things like scurvy, say, for example, or something like that. I mean, I know this isn't quite how it works, but you have these people living here, and for some reason there's one town by the sea that's not getting scurvy, while all the other towns by the sea are getting scurvy. Right? Scientists go in, they go, or doctors go in, why aren't these people getting scurvy? They find out they're eating a lot of limes. Right? So they've discovered vitamin C, but when it's applied as a medicine, it's not applied as in the same way. It's not applied as, here, eat some limes, because they would refine it and make it work better. So the original stuff is seances, is marketing, is things like this, but if you're a scientist, you're looking at this and going, right, so what is making this happen? How do we make it happen? You know, and I like the idea. I like the idea of, he goes to this seance. Okay, the clock's working. The experiment keeps trying the same thing again, and he can't get the result the same every time until much later on, when there's a lot more kind of dead souls around, and suddenly, oh wait, we can get them in, and we can get them in droves, you know, kind of thing.
That was a bit rambly. Sorry.
No, I was sort of. I think the sort of question you're actually asking is quite important. You know, but a séance seems like a good starting point. So I'm just thinking, what happens to the séance, and what could we interpret as for Pat's analogy, the eating limes? You know, is it the thinking about dead people? Is that why you got different result? Why it gets different results all the time? Is because each person thinks in a different way, or doesn't think as much about a dead person, or is not? And is it something that people are doing, or is it something about the physical setup of it? You know, the joining hands, turning out the lights. You know, I'm just trying to angle in on sort of what is actually triggering this strange event, this magic. Has anyone got any specific thoughts on that? Pat?
Is that me?
Yes, sorry, Pat.
If you look at kind of accepted ghost hunter theory, which I have to say for the record, I completely do not believe in ghosts or spirits or any of that stuff, but a very common trope in that thing is that you don't get a revenant, you don't get a repetitive spirit unless there's a trauma of some kind involved in the death or involved in their life in some way. So not every not every person who dies is a potential energy source, you know. So if you can walk around, you know, a graveyard and you're not going to get the results, but you walk around a slaughterhouse and you might, you know. Even or to a much lesser extent, because I'd imagine that the higher the animal, the better the result you'd get. Makes sense.
That's the nature of the soul or the spirit. It could be a very important thing. So it's got to be said from a purely a setting design point of view, having it so that the more traumatic and horrible the death, the more powerful the spirit is, actually lends a very dark undertone to the whole setting. So yes, so maybe the critical thing is that there's some connection between the living and the dead, and that connection is different when it's a hugely traumatic experience. Now, there's a bit of a leap, but one of the ways you can describe life is as a waveform. If you are born as a waveform full of energy, and waves carry a long time until they just gradually lose that energy until something interrupts them. And you can see that as a wave gradually losing energy compared to a human life getting older and gradually dying. And there's sort of it's a philosophical way of looking at life in a physical way. And if you think about life as a waveform, then a life which has suddenly ended crashes. And you think about a wave crashing against a seashore, a seawall in a storm. That's a huge amount of energy being released all of a sudden. And maybe that's what we're sort of looking at, to put it in some sort of physical world, is that traumatic death releases energy which sort of resonates outward. For it must take years to be useful, to power things ongoing. So yeah, traumatic death, some sort of energy released, some way to capture that. Mark, I think you had some ideas on how Aleister Crowley can fit into this.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I'm aware, he was active in the sort of very early 20th century, 10s and 20s, which puts him in a pretty ideal position for this, because he espoused the idea of hermetic magic, I think, which is kind of a scientific approach to researching into magic. And I think he did a lot with demonology as well. So I can imagine him being one of the major scientific figures of this. So what Rutherford is to the atom and all the technologies that derive from that, Crowley then becomes towards all the demon-powered stuff. Because one thing you've got to remember here is that I think a lot of the stuff we've been talking about with all the traumatic deaths and so on, that's good underlying material, but it's not what goes in the front of the book, because the point is that people don't know it's people. So if we go for the Crowley demonology side of things, say him and Rutherford with their magic and radiation detectors, where would have reproduced this early 1860s experiment with the seance and then make it stick.
Yeah,
he's a pretty well-known historical character. He can actually kind of fix this off.
yeah, you make a great point, both from a sort of like a sales point. Now, as to Crowley, people have got some associated images with that and things. And I was thinking that probably if you want to sum up sort of the setting so far, it's Aleister Crowley and Rutherford winning a joint Nobel Prize for their necromantic technology.
Yeah.
And because that tells us, the merging of hard science with complete magic, is, critical. So I really like that idea. We might have to check the dates and work out a likely combination of people, but a joint Nobel Prize being sort of landmark, we've got the technology. So, and just to recap, we've got something like a cloud chamber which shows the energy coming in. And it's when people think about, or let's call it a rite, when there's a rite, when people think about someone who has died at a traumatic death or in a location where traumatic death has occurred, then that's where the energy comes from. That's what powers the devices. So let's just step forward a little bit in time from that. Okay, so we've got this technology, it definitely exists. What's the first practical use of it? A first product you can buy, or the first military use, or whatever. What's the first practical use of this necromantic technology? So, has anyone got thoughts on that? Pat?
I didn't think.
Sorry, you took your mic off mute. I misread that. Jay is waving.
Yeah. When they first started off, the amount of spirit energy they're able to capture is not going to be particularly big.
Yeah.
Or if they do, right, so general rule of thumb, when you first discover anything, the amount you can either wield is small, or the amount you can create is small, or the amount you can control is small. So you could have a situation where they've not got fine control over the right process, and sometimes they summon quite pathetic little spirits, sometimes they summon incredibly powerful spirits. So they might be aiming to plough this clock, and they get somebody with the net and the calorific output of a motor car, and then the watch just explodes. So that could be one thing. I perhaps think that to begin with, the process isn't very refined. So they start off with it's small commercial products. So it's spinning tops that don't fall over. It's whistles that don't stop making noise. It's simple little clockwork devices, very basic little electronic radios, is what they've got at the end of the 1920s. That's what I think they start off with, small little things.
I love the idea that it starts with a children's toy, because that's something innocent and something simple and pleasurable, but behind it unknowingly there's this huge dark secret. I think is very fits the setting. So and it gives the way the culture will develop, because children who grew up with this technology, who got those spinning toys at their 4th birthday or whatever, by the time they're in their 30s and 40s is when the time they're discovering about all the horrible things it also means. And so it'll be culturally very different, much like if people, say, Pat's age and younger, suddenly discovered the internet gave you cancer. It completely changes a lot about the way something important in your life, something you've grown up with, is viewed. So yeah, children, simple mechanic devices, things which defy the laws of nature in some respect. So we're talking 1925, post-World War I, lots of dead people relatively recently, relatively easy to power these things. And I'm thinking that if you've got children's toys you can make spin, then it's not much of a leap to someone to go, well, can I power my factory with that? Can I power my production line? So that basic principle, just like steam engines evolved, will be, get them into the factories and provide power. So what's going to be, you think, the first real thing which changes society in the way that, say, you know, we introduced video recorders, fax machines, or smartphones, or whatever. What's the first big real social change? Pat?
I was just looking at stuff about electricity, and it kind of fits our timeline. If we're talking that Crowley and Rutherford first developed this kind of technology as a system, within the time scale of that, it's possible that, say, Van de Graaff, who did a lot of experiments in projected electricity, might not have studied electricity at university, might have studied demonology and figured out exactly how much better applications for using it, not only as a power source, but as essentially a weapon, or as a well,
yeah, I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, he would then take that sort of role as the first person to bring it up as make it practical. And then Jay, you've just shouted in the chat, Tesla, yeah, and another likely candidate for that, who takes that shift from electricity to necromantic magic to drive power. So I think we're talking about here, big social change is the rapid spread of reliable power and power sources, independent power sources, which can drive things. So we're heading into the 1930s. Society, you know, is probably improving a bit, differentiating from ours in a little way, because they've got better sources of power than just coal and oil, which they've been burning at the time. But the big picture in terms of the rise of fascism in Europe and all those sorts of things is happening. So as we approach World War II, how is this necromantic power going to be used, and how is it going to change history? And what does the consequences of World War II have on necromancy itself, with all these extra dead bodies, or dead souls? Mark?
Yeah, so because talking about it being this changing technologies and stuff which became risky later on, I've got two threads here in my mind. One is computers, and one is the nuclear technologies. So in the computing case, obviously Second World War brings us Colossus, the first big programmable computer. And say in that case, it was something which was kept very, very secret, that you could start using demonology to bind together either very powerful demons or the complex networks of them to do logic. And thus the first Colossus is built by summoning these things. Then from then on, you start looking at using demons and some of the beings as electronics and computers, which then is really, really, really good. We start looking at the ghost in the machine with who we realize it's humans. The other thread was with the nuclear technologies, because the kind of timeline we're talking about here lines up very closely with the timeline of the uranium chain reaction, which was known to exist before the beginning of the war, and part of the effort from the start of that was making the bomb. So say something that they were able to achieve with making the bomb was, well, I believe it was actually compressing a huge number of demons and their power into a very, very small point, and then dropping out of an aeroplane on Japan. So that then lands, releases this huge amount of energy, destroys Hiroshima, but instead of radioactive fallout, you get kind of spiritual fallout. So there's ravening ghosts and evil spirits and all sorts in those areas where no one can go back there. It's not that it gives you cancer, it's rather that they steal your soul and destroy you.
Yes, I think that's a great point, you know, because we've got such a landmark in history as the uranium bomb and Hiroshima and all the rest of it, and we still want that to happen, because roughly we want World War II to play out as it happened. So it's about the bomb. There's a race to get to some theoretical point where they obviously understand necromancy enough to have this theory that they can build a bomb, and so, yeah, that I think is a really interesting thing, because then, I mean, in parallels to our time, they dropped the bomb, they thought it was just a big bomb, then it was obviously came out over the following years, actually just how dangerous nuclear bombs were, and so that changed our understanding, and that could be how we change our understanding of necromancy in this world. So yeah, the bomb. Let's just riff on that a little bit. What could be the theoretical thing? Because the splitting the atom and the whole stuff with the Manhattan Project and things like that. What's our sort of necromantic equivalent to that whole idea? Mark, sorry, Jay, you've got some thoughts on how this is going to play out and affect the war?
Yeah, riffing on to what you were talking about as well as power. How would the bomb work? Well, the way the nuclear bomb works is that you just pile drive enough neutrons into enough uranium, and they all fission and split at essentially the same time, and that's a vast energy release. So I think perhaps what you could do with the spirit bomb is essentially they've either got it so that they've compressed a vast amount of spirit energy to a very small container, or when the bomb hits the ground, it acts as a uncontrolled summon.
Oh, so it's the process of summoning which is contained in the bomb, and suddenly you release it.
Yeah, so it's the inside of the bomb is essentially covered in what they use to essentially summon, and so I can almost imagine it's either something I don't know if it's something you would drop, because that sounds like it might be a little bit fragile. So I imagine rather than Enola Gay dropping something, you've got a special forces team sneaks into Hiroshima, sets this thing up, and then it just, essentially it's a completely uncontrolled or explosive release of spirit energy. Now, the problem you get with us trying to bind them together is then you have to start trying to come up with ideas. Well, how much spirit pressure can you get? Is there a limit to the amount of energy you can get into one kind of spirit thing? Or, the idea that it was literally an explosion. Flipping that back on its head, in terms of what effect on the war would have, if you've got essentially what a spirit device is an incredibly efficient and powerful battery or power source, a significant proportion of the Allied war is won because we deny the Germans and the Japanese fuel. Yeah. And if they're using spirit energy instead, the war, I don't think, finishes anywhere near as soon.
Right, yes, I think it'd be very different. I just wanted to go back a bit, because you were talking about how a bomb works, and it's a chain reaction. And you talked about a summoning device as well as an alternative. And I thought, well, what if we combine this too? What if you killed someone and immediately summoned their soul? You know, if you had a normal bomb which exploded, killing a few people, and that the energy from those spirits being released feeds back and creates a bigger explosion, killing more people, and feeds back, which are then summoned, and then feeds back and expands outwards. You can have a chain reaction of sudden death and summoning, giving you a sort of like a theoretical, uncontained chain reaction. So yeah, I think there's some good ideas we can have on how the bomb works. Pat, some thoughts about how the Manhattan Project or its equivalent will play out.
Yeah, the one thing I was just going to say about thinking is I still don't know if these people actually know that it's dead people that they're using for their bombs. But you were saying my version is kind of simplistic in comparison. But if you summon something, or not necessarily just one thing, but summon a lot of kind of rather nasty kind of like, I don't know, gamma level gribbly demons into a containment grid, containment field, some kind of, like magical barrier that you have inside the bomb shell, and then you drop the bomb, and the bomb explodes. That's an instant release of all of those creatures.
Oh yeah, so it's sort of that they want to be naturally quite big, or take up a lot of energy. So by compressing it, you are storing energy effectively, and then suddenly release. It's just like any bomb; it's a sudden release of energy. So yeah, that works nicely. But did you have some thoughts about how the Manhattan Project would develop?
Oh yes, I had. I did have a bit of an idea about how it can still progress in the same way, and it goes into some quite nasty territory. But the US were working on their weapons project, and obviously the Nazis were doing the same. But if you've got if we're working towards like a spirit bomb rather than a scientific bomb, your Nazis were, like, a lot of the higher ups were kind of involved in very strange clubs anyway, and they could be very much of the belief that the best way to do it is a very old-fashioned, very traditional kind of ritual. You know, you get like 13 men in robes and hoods, you sacrifice somebody, God knows, the Nazis had lots of people to sacrifice, and you do it that way. Whereas across the pond, the US are kind of experimenting with how do we make this more and more efficient, how do we get it away from mysticism and towards science more and more, and so they come to the conclusion quicker, basically.
Yeah, that's the interesting two philosophies. So the sort of the Nazis are trying to make it more occult, and the Americans are trying to make it more scientific, and ultimately the American Allied forces win out because that's the right call, it turns out to be. Now, must touch on a point here, because we're talking here about World War II and the Nazis and harvesting souls. And the elephant in the room is, of course, the death camps. Now, we have to sort of address that, and obviously it's something we have to do sensitively, which doesn't mean we can't be imaginative and, you know, even quite horrible about what we do with the death camps, but we must approach it from a point that obviously this is a touchy subject and we must take special care for that. So what I want to do is just put that idea in your head and we'll park it, because I think we might need a discussion on that subject all by itself about how we handle that. Okay. No, it's a vital thing to bring up. So now, Jay, you had some thoughts about radiation and spirits. Mute. Jay, your mic.
There. Mark's mentioned the cloud chamber. Just because Rutherford does work with Cowley doesn't mean he's going to stop being interested in radiation. So it's just, as always, humanity technology development always seems to follow the path of least resistance. So they are going to go down the spirit energy because it is so easy. But I just had the idea that you could combine radiation technology with spirit technology. It'd be interesting to see if there was some interaction with them. I.e., what uranium does, how would radioactive materials or radiation interact with the spirit world in some way, shape, or form? Is uranium actually just spirit, or that which came to my head? No, the one thing, because Mark, one thing we probably got to sit and think about is say we're talking about, particularly say the clock, the original pocket watch gets a spirit in it, and it never stops going. It's still ticking even to this day in the museum it's in. Does this mean that all spirit energy is essentially rotational?
A question only a physicist would ask.
Yeah, well, here's the thing, because it's in the back of my head because of the work I do. We're building this incredible star chamber to mimic the fusion powers of the sun, and then we're going to use it to boil water. So it does matter a little bit because it will significantly influence the technology that comes off it. Because if you just get electric charge out of these things, incredible. We're on our way. Totally useless for space travel. But on land, suddenly the electric revolution that we're beginning to have now with electric cars happens immediately in the 1940s. Battleships, tanks, everything suddenly becomes electric. If it's rotational, then it still becomes electric because that's the quickest way of getting power out of it. But you also do direct drive. If it's just heat, then actually our technology doesn't change a lot. It's just a different source of coal. So that is something I'm going to keep in my head a little bit because it will make a difference. It's how we gauge how different we want this world to be. If we want it to be very similar to ours, then spirit energy is just heat.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it's something we're going to have to talk about further. And it sort of leads on to what I just want to sort of finish off fairly briefly with, is we're now here at sort of basically the end of World War II. Now, we started this idea as 1940s necromancy, but that doesn't mean that's when we make the setting. When do we want the setting? Do we want it just like immediately post-war? What about the 50s or early 60s? And all the way up to present day? It'd be fun in some respects to extrapolate it all the way to present day. So interesting. Where do we end? Where do we actually put this game? Where does the setting take place? And one thing I want you to consider is the visuals, because certain eras, late 50s, early 60s, start of a jet age, very strong visuals, very changing social things, whereas World War II, certainly post-World War II, 1945 to 1950, wasn't a particularly iconic time in itself because everything was very drab, we were still recovering from the war. So, Pat, have you some thoughts on when we should actually take the setting up to?
Well, I still like the idea of the 40s. It's a nice aesthetic. There's not a lot of stuff setting in the 40s, which is a shame because there's a lot that kind of went on. I just like the idea of rockabilly demons as well. So there's that. Em will tell you all about it if she wasn't asleep, because Em knows more about the 40s. Em.
Let us sleep. Don't wait your wife up to do this. The 40s are nice. Yeah, I mean, you were absolutely right. And so if you take it post-war, 1945 to 1950, I mean, what other setting tackles that era? Because it's the dull bit. Surely the war's the interesting bit. And I think actually the setting could take things in a nice way in terms of exploiting that hole. And some interesting questions about, starting to plan nuclear power stations and start of jet engines in terms of fighter jets. We're just coming in post-war. So how does necromantic technology change that? Jay or Mark, have you got any thoughts on when we should actually set this?
I'm still happy to go with the 40s. There's a lot of good politics there as well, because that's when the Cold War really is starting to happen. So that's when it started again. The Americans were suddenly worrying that the Soviets had just detonated the bomb and things like that. So you get a lot of competition over who can make the most demon bombs and that kind of thing. I had this wonderful image of Americans worried about a demon gap rather than the bomber gap they worried about before in real life. And McCarthyism is all about trying to track down the commies who are going to summon horrible demons in the middle of Washington and New York and try and stop them doing that. So you've got a lot of politics to drive the game there, I think.
Yeah, and that's taking it into sort of the early 50s, isn't it?
Kind of scope for play. But it means you can do a kind of a 40s nasty kind of setting and you're not fighting Nazis. That's done. You can go deal with other people and fight other people.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. Yeah, I'm thinking, say, 48 is an interesting year, because I can't quite remember when the first Soviet bomb went off, but it wasn't that long after that. And also, I think 48 was at the Berlin airlift as well, so when really the Cold War got cold. And so you're right on that cusp of changing eras and technologies. And yeah, and pointing the way to head this arms race of spirit bombs. Okay, yes, Jay, one final thought on social aspects of this.
Yeah, the 1940s is a really interesting, the late night, our post-war is not good, because in Britain, it's the first Labour government is suddenly in charge. So we could have a discussion about how has this affected what's going to happen. It's like, well, is Attlee elected Prime Minister? Do you have the significant and vast social changes that happen in the post-war period when Britain essentially rebuilds itself into a very different country than it's before the war? It's not just the Blitz; it's the whole change in ethos that occurs with a significant breakdown in structural biases, and that kicks in less in the Americas, but all over Europe, the entire social structure is completely reformed after the war. And the fact that the war potentially, I mean, we can make the Second World War much nastier because there is simply more energy available to the combatants. which will have an effect. But I think it's a good thing about the 1940s is so much of our modern stuff happens then.
Yes, it does. And just the other thing about 1948 is it's when George Orwell wrote 1984. You know, the classic sort of prediction device of Stalinism and things like that. So there's some interesting things we can riff on there. I think we're out of time. I mean, clearly this is a huge thing, and we've definitely got this buzz and thing we like about this 1940s thing and about this world, which I think is coming together. So, which leads us on to what we're going to talk about next week. And if unless anyone's got any strong ideas, I say more about this.
Yeah, I think we could. We've talked about the history. Now we could talk about the society, the people who are in it, what kind of monsters live in the shadows. I think makes a good idea to whack out.
Second that, because we've spent a fair bit of time this week getting stuck in terms of technology, and quite a hard bit. I would say that actually starting to think about how is this going to affect people. I mean, we've used the phrase demon a fair bit in this one as well. It'd be interesting to start talking about what actually is that. Is that just another word for a spirit engine, or is it actually something different? So I think getting more into character and narrative things for next week would be good.
Okay, just a quick thought. There's two ways we could tackle this. We can tackle it in the way we've done in sort of like talking, but basically designing the setting in terms of sort of mapping out its progress. Or we can tackle it from the other end and actually say, okay, so we've got a bunch of players who have got characters. What are these characters and what are they doing? So we almost tackle it from completely the other end of the spectrum. Has anyone thought, do we want us to carry this sort of like soft setting or focus actually on some of the hard questions of what are the characters going to do, what are the adventures going to be like?
I vote for plot generation. I like that idea. Let's see what stories we can tell with this.
So from where we are now, we think about what adventures we're going to run, what sort of path the character might have, just in the loose sense, what occupations, sort of thing. So sort of people happy with that sort of idea? Just nod or wave, yeah.
Yeah, I think as we generate the characters, we'll ask questions of what vocations can there be, and then we'll start answering the social questions from them. Why does that profession exist, and that kind of thing. So I think that should fill in pretty well.
Yeah, we'll sort of hopefully join in the middle and they'll mesh together. Okay, Jay, would you like to take the lead for next week and put together the sort of the briefing and get it out to people?
If I haven't done it by Tuesday, please remind me, because I'm working on something else this evening.
I will do. Okay, let's quickly wrap up with the pluses and deltas. Pat, would you like to run us through those?
Sorry. Okay, pluses and deltas. We'll start from the furthest on my left, which is Chris Tregenza. Chris, what are your pluses and deltas for this week?
Fuck. Plus.
Well, you said fuck, so Jay now.
Plus, I really like this setting. I think it sort of ticks us. It's very us as a group in that it's a mix of science and magic, and I think and the fanciful, and I think that really reflects us as people. The downside, I'm going to say, muting mics and the ability to have them muted or unmuted at entirely the wrong moments, especially when I say fuck.
Okay, Jay.
Just a sec, I'm still typing up what Chris was saying. It might take a little bit of time. FUC mics. Yeah, I like the setting. I am actually my best plus of this. I'm looking forward to what we're going to do next week with plot generation, characters, and that. I think it's not a way I've approached world generation before. I tend to get really stuck into a lot of detail of the map kind of level and the history level. So approaching it from the idea of what stories I can tell with this is going to be interesting. Deltas, it's raining.
Okay, Mark, if you'll unmute your mic.
Yeah, pluses. Boom, boom. So I like using the mechanism of these meetings to kind of flesh out a setting, because we've gone very quickly from last week of, oh, here's a fun little idea, which got sketched down the notepad before I opened my mouth and started talking, and we flashed out a lot of meeting then to then go into discussing it more. I noticed we had a lot of activity on the social media, G Plus in particular, which sadly we didn't get to go through today. But the fact that it's kind of caught up and there's been a lot of activity there, and we're going to carry on going this even further. I'm really enjoying this process of actually working this out and coming up with it as much as I'm enjoying it.
It's nice to build it in a very open way so people can see how it's developing as well and get excited.
Yeah.
And, you know,
so that's the point of these, and it's working very well. Deltas. I'm in a really uncomfortable position sitting on this bed with an old laptop that's melting my left knee. So I'll go with that. And Chris and everybody else has said a bad word. He said a swear word, and that's wrong.
Yeah, okay, and my pluses and deltas, I have to agree with everybody else. I'm loving this what we're doing with these kind of things. It's brilliant, and it's right up my street in terms of how a setting should be put together. It's got enough kind of nasty mysteries that just waiting there to turn around and dribble you in the face. Yeah, deltas, bit of potty mouth. Bit of potty mouth, that's what I'm going to say. Alright, I think back to Chris, is it? And the poorly wife.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much, Pat. Okay, I'm going to say this now because we'll forget. Jay's just pinged that we're going to need a working title, and he's absolutely right. So that's something to think about, and if you're watching and you've got ideas of what can we call this setting, which is better than 1940s necromancy, please send us your ideas. We're out of time, so that's it. So goodbye from me, Pat, Jay, and Mark, and we will see you at the same time next week, 7 o'clock Friday UK time. Bye-bye.